Allora, buonasera a tutti, buon anno. It's my first event introducing this calendar year. I'm Steve Milner, Director of the British School at Rome, and it's my delight today to welcome Associate Professor Jane Grogan from UCD to give the Society for Renaissance Studies lecture. The SRS is an organisation close to the heart of many academics who pass, and scholars and art historians and artists who pass through the British School at Rome. So we're delighted to have this partnership. We look forward to extending it further and looking at other channels and opportunities for building activity together, given the long history of Renaissance interests that have been pursued over the generations here at the BSR. So tell you a little bit about Jane, and she can scream in embarrassment at the hagiography that follows. Jane did her PhD at Royal Holloway. She's authored 2 monographs, one on the Chewit poet Edmund Spenser, Exemplary Spenser in 2009, I think it was, and a second on early modern English interest in Persia, the Persian Empire and English Renaissance writing, 1549 to 1622. She's edited a number of collections of essays, including a forthcoming volume on early modern European interest in the ancient Near East, and has published essays on subjects including epic values, Shakespeare's classical sources, the modern Irish reception of Spenser, and Spenser in Irish literary history. She's the past president, you're noticing a theme arising here, of the International Spenser Society. She co-edits the Spenser Review and is the Irish representative to Council of the Society for Renaissance Studies, taking over from Sarah Allen Stacey, I assume, or there's one between. Oh, okay. So it's a delight to have her here today to talk about, on the title of Translation, Travel and Treason, William Barker in Early Modern Italy and England. And I'd like you to give her a very warm welcome this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here at the British School at Rome. I can't believe I haven't discovered such a treasure already. You're all very fortunate. And I wanted to thank especially Steve for hosting the SRS lecture. For those of you who have any interest in Renaissance studies, from any approach, any discipline, please join. We do all kinds of good things and have money to, organise conferences and things as well. But I also wanted to thank Harriet O'Neill for being so supportive, and also wanted to thank the new award holders here, whose work I felt very privileged to hear a little bit about last night. But I do have to apologise first for luring you in here with that poster, with that kind of wonderfully tense portrait of the Tudor succession. Which is, as I say on the poster, it was originally in the Walsingham family, it's now held in Wales, and this is sort of what's inscribed on it. You can see it's talking about Henry, a face of much nobility in a little room, 4 states with their conditions, a father more than valiant, that's Henry, a rare and virtuous son, there he is, let me find this, yeah, there's Edward down there, rare and virtuous son, a zealous daughter in her kind. Let's be a little bit careful about that. That's Mary with Philip and the god of war behind them, just in case you were uncertain as to their interests. And last of all, a virgin queen, to England's joy, we see successively to hold the right and virtues of the 3. And as I say, you can see her very much highlighted in this portrait. She's got peace held by the hand, stamping on the sword of discord. You've got plenty in the cornucopia over there as well. I love the way that this portrait sort of brings everyone together, grimly facing forward under this canopy of state, and the way it tries to smooth away the great turbulence and troubles of the succession to Henry VIII, the multiple changes to state religion, the persecutions, the doubts, the plots, the sheer savagery. But actually, today, the apology, I won't be talking about the Tudors themselves, but rather about an almost forgotten figure from the English Renaissance whose life was shaped again and again by the tensions that this portrait tries so hard to bury. So William Barker was a Norfolk Catholic who got a Cambridge education through the intercessions of Anne Boleyn, bizarrely, and he spent some years in Italy before returning to England upon the accession of Catholic Queen Mary. He took a post in the household of the Duke of Norfolk. He published a series of important but often overlooked translations from Greek, Latin and Italian, and he ended up in the Tower of London for his trouble, being interrogated about his part in the Ridolfi plot against the life of Queen Elizabeth in 1571, of which more later. But his career doesn't really fit the usual models of early modern authorship or scholarship. And I think that looking a little more closely at his career points us towards, or maybe encourages us to have a more inclusive, more politically nuanced, and maybe more socially diverse understanding of English Renaissance literature. And just to warn you, I'm not even going to go into it, but I'm going to use the terms early modern and Renaissance pretty interchangeably here. So, to begin, one of the big shifts in Shakespeare studies in recent years, well, the last 20 years to be fair, is that Shakespeare was sometimes a co-author. Using new digital resources, scholars have uncovered something that was patiently waiting to be discovered. That is, the fact that the great theatre tradition of Elizabethan and Jacobean England was in more ways than one collaborative. That is, that it wasn't just journeyman dramatists who wrote together, and that while the competitive market forces of the new theatres in some ways helped produce this extraordinary age of theatre, on the other hand, the competitive motivation didn't really percolate all the way through. And finally, that the kinds of collaborations that we all know go into making theatre today between designers, directors, technicians, actors, writers, and so much more, were also operational in the early modern period. So the theatre, it's now widely accepted, was a site of collaboration, even across rival companies, even across and within, the concept of dramatic authorship. But that sense of collaborative authorship in drama of the period hasn't really crossed over into our sense of how the literary culture of early modern England at large was produced. And it's still assumed that it was largely the work of individual independent authors, sometimes overlapping, but usually sole agents. And actually, you might be aware that there's a whole sort of subfield of scholarship devoted to the notion that actually the early moderns invented the idea of authorship. But in this case, authorship is a kind of a fiercely individual effort to imitate the careers, such as they were thought to be, the careers of ancient authors like Ovid and Virgil. I'm not sure that any author anywhere has ever been that organised about their career, so I find it a little difficult to believe those theories. But in a way, what I suppose I'm pointing out is there is some investment and interest in the concept of authorship in the early modern period, and I'm maybe arguing that we're focusing a little too much on the individual in that case, rather than on social models. But there's plenty of indicators out there that we should be thinking more carefully about what kinds of collaboration are involved in writing and publishing literary work in the 16th century. We all know about the prevalence of patronage and patronal networks, for example, which meant that few books were produced without the visible support of other persons being advertised, even whether they liked it or not. And the famous example that's always given here is of Stephen Gosson, who dedicated his attack on literature, the school of abuse, to Sir Philip Sidney, who was the author of the most famous and most prominent defence of literature in the period. As Richard McCabe points out, the dedicating author's aim is to secure some visible mark of reciprocation. In other words, books are already marked as social transactions with ends beyond their immediate achievement of just publication or readership. Similarly, scholars of manuscript publication and women's writing have emphasised the importance of literary coteries in the period, both for readers and for authors. So, again, the famous example is that of Mary Sidney, Countess of Pembroke, who sort of headed one of the best known of these literary societies. And the interest of Mary Sidney's coterie in the writing and translation of closet drama is a good example of how coteries stimulated and nurtured literary work for a particular group or within a particular group, and maybe with cherishing particular genres. What I want to talk about today is something less formal than a coterie and less unequal than a patron-client relationship as advertised in a book's dedication. Instead, I want to look at the kinds of informal but powerfully enduring intellectual and social networks that encouraged, shaped and sustained literary and scholarly effort in the period. The networks that helped get those efforts printed and helped get them read. And this involves doing things like looking a little more closely at others who were involved in the publication process, notably printers, and I think this is something that's done much better in Italian studies than it is in English Renaissance studies, although it's a growing field. The kind of networks I'm talking about are networks that had, I think we see in this example, the capacity to trump even the kinds of religious and political bonds that were so crucial to survival amid the upheavals of the mid-16th century. And my example here, William Barker, is from before the time of Shakespeare and Sidney and Spencer and the big names, I suppose, if you like, but is very much of the generation that enabled and educated those figures. So I'll start with a brief overview of Barker's life before focusing on 3 key moments in which we see those kinds of networks in operation. So firstly, his time in Cambridge, that's the translation of my title, his time in Italy, the travel, and what transpired in the Tower, treason. Here is the DNB entry for Barker. It's short and fanciful and pretty inaccurate. It presents him as a humble but clever man who hung around with aristocrats and amused himself by translating Italian comic works during his stay in Tuscany, but who found when he returned to England that he didn't get to hang around with the same aristocrats and felt a bit disappointed. It's true there's a lot of uncertainty around Barker's life, but I've been able to fill in a lot of the gaps with the help of the archives, although there is still a good bit of sort of reasoned speculation, I'll call it, in there as well. We don't know much about his origins. He's almost certainly from Norfolk. He comes to our attention in 1535 when he goes to St. John's College, Cambridge, thanks to a scholarship from Anne Boleyn, probably on the recommendation of her uncle Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. Anne Boleyn herself got executed only a year later, but Barker somehow was able to stay on. I'd love to know who paid his fees, but that's something the archives still haven't told me. By 1540, he'd been elected a Fellow of St. John's, and he remained in this position until 1549, when he left for Italy, where he spent the next 3 years. He returned late in 1552 or early 1553, just after the accession of Catholic Queen Mary. And his Catholicism is something that's evidenced at all stages of his life, but interestingly, his friends and the company he keeps are not necessarily Catholic. Soon after, he took up a position in the household of Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, and became Howard's secretary, a highly responsible and trusted member of the household, probably also serving as tutor to the young Philip Howard, who was later canonised as one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales executed under Queen Elizabeth. Along the way, he published several translations, a sermon by the Greek church father Basil the Great on the virtues of reading pagan literature, in other words, classical literature, 2 contemporary Italian dialogues, a selection of Appian's Roman history, a manuscript translation of Isocrates' Mirror for Princes to Nicocles, and a full translation of Xenophon's Cyropaedia, which is, I think, his most important achievement. It's the first printed English translation of a seminal text of the humanist educational curriculum, but also a seminal text in 16th century political theory. It's a kind of an instructive but fictionalized biography of the ancient Persian emperor Cyrus the Great, and it was kind of crucial to a lot of the Mirror for Princes, and as I say, the political theory of the period, including people like Machiavelli, found it of interest. Have I got it at that point? Sorry. Oh yes, that's the Xenophon. It had always, I should say that by the time Barker, even though Barker's is the first substantial Greek translation of it, by this point it had already been translated into German, French, Italian, Spanish, and of course Latin by brilliant scholars like Francesco Filelfo and polygraphy like Lodovico Domenici. So England was pretty late to the party as usual. The most important social and intellectual networks for Barker were those formed first at Cambridge and then in Italy, where he spent most of the reign of King Edward VI. As I say, thanks to some recent archival work, we now know that Barker didn't just study at Cambridge from 1535, but as I say, was elected to a fellowship at St. John's and stayed on as a fellow until his Italian sojourn. Records for his election don't survive, but from some letters by Roger Askham to Sir John Chake in the early 1540s, it's now possible to propose that Chake had been his tutor, and that Chake and perhaps even Askham supported his election. There's a lot of names in this section. I'm not deliberately just dropping names. They kind of will come up again in other ways. Chake and Askham were key figures for him both professionally and in terms of his scholarly interests, because St. John's was the leading college for Greek learning at the time, having initiated Greek studies in England by hosting Erasmus to lecture on Greek in 1511, but most famously through the teaching, research and advocacy of John Chake, First Regius Professor of Greek from 1540. He'd been teaching at St. John's since 1533. Barker's relationship with Chake as his pupil and subsequently as one of the scholars devoted to Chake's cause, his great cause that he kind of continued throughout his life of Greek scholarship, was to prove one of the most important of his life, because despite his Catholicism, it gave him entry and visibility to a circle of friends and supporters of Chake and his project. And also Chake was quite involved in the sort of the new Protestant or evangelical cause. I had put together a really awkward PowerPoint of some of these figures with Chake in the middle. And then I remembered that there's this lovely 17th century engraving, which is about Askham. It's Askham presenting to Queen Elizabeth, but it's got lots of the same kind of overlapping people from the Chake circle. You can see them down the bottom there. So Thomas Smith, Cecil, a few others I'd pick out. But there's also people like, so Roger Askham, the noted scholar, William Cecil, future Secretary of State to Queen Elizabeth, and scholars, translators and government officials like Sir Thomas Smith, Thomas Wilson, Thomas Hoby, Walter Haddon, Walter Mildmay, and people like that. Slydan as well is a sort of European Protestant who was very important to this circle. Many of this group translated themselves or supported the translation of Greek authors. I should say this is quite a niche activity in England at the time, despite what we might think now. The Oxford History of Literature translation estimates that translation from the Greek represented maybe only 7% of translation that was happening in England at the time, and that includes people who were translating from Latin intermediaries. So it was relatively rare. In fact, translation from Italian was higher, was around 10 or 11%. The translations of this group argued again and again for the utility of Greek authors, especially on topics like governance, on political virtues, on how to behave, on the conduct of young men in particular. So they favoured prose authors like Xenophon, Isocrates and Demosthenes. This circle around Chake had close connections with the court, as you can see. A lot of them served as tutors, not just to Edward VI, but also to the young Elizabeth, and continued to be her tutor as well. As I say, Chake himself was appointed tutor, but a bunch of the others sort of were involved in that effort too. It's always useful to have connections in government, and this group's main connection with government was William Cecil, who, as I say, later Lord Burghley. He became Elizabeth's Secretary of State and her right-hand man, and he had a very long life and was influential throughout his long life, and was very much there for Elizabeth and was the main kind of gateway figure to her. Cecil's links to St. John's College were strong. He was an important supporter of the college and a patron of their alumni, and he was the person that the college and even the university called when there was a little financial scandal to be explained away and things like that as well. He actually also married the sister of Sir John Chake, who was also living in Cambridge and who Barker would have known, but she died a few years later. However, Chake could only have approved of his choice of second wife, Mildred Cook, one of the famously learned Cook sisters, whose special ability for Greek Cecil would highlight in her tomb, which is in Westminster Abbey, I think it's quite moving, the epitaph he wrote for her, which acknowledges how she was conversant with sacred literature and the writings of holy men, especially those Greeks, such as Basil, Chrysostom, Gregory Nazianzus, and so on. So I suppose this network of Protestant scholarly connections with Chake as its central node is surprisingly long-lasting. Its impetus, what held this quite diverse group together, was a commitment to the study of Greek, a commitment to the translation from Greek, as well as scholarship of the authors in the original Greek. And it's only recently that I suppose we've been able to add Barker to this network. It was Chake who found Barker's translation of Xenophon a printer, and not just any old printer, but Rainer Wolf, who was one of the most accomplished printers of the day. He was a Protestant refugee from modern Netherlands, a future co-founder of the Stationers' Company and a committed Protestant. Although dedicatory epistles aren't usually to be trusted, we can believe Barker's declaration that when he returned from, that when he returned from Italy, he found 6 books of the Cyropaedia imprinted not by my desire, but only by the courtesy and goodwill of the printer, a furtherer of good learning. The second complete edition of the Cyropaedia, also printed by Woolf 15 years later, mentions the encouragement of diverse of my learned friends as having motivated him to complete the translation. So he published 6 books in about 1552-53. It's unfinished, there's 8 books in it, and the full thing is published later. And there's some really interesting kind of linguistic traces of Italy in the 1567, in the full edition, in books 7 and 8. Some phrases, there's one used in, the word for horseman is a word derived from Spanish, originally derived from Arabic, as alferes, which again sort of is not used anywhere else in English literature, but is clearly comes from his experience of having visited probably the Kingdom of Naples. Cheek himself had died in 1557. He had left England after the accession of Catholic Queen Mary, although she then had him kidnapped and returned to London, where he was forced to recant. But the power and influence of those learned friends, the Cecils, the Askhams, the Thomas Smiths, around Cheek seems to have continued, as did their appreciation for the Cyropaedia in particular, as one of the staples of the humanist curriculum from its earliest days. The Education of Cyrus, as it was called, held great prestige and attraction, particularly in the educational and political spheres, and in Europe, particularly among Protestant scholars like Philip Melanchthon and Johannes Sleidan, who we saw in the Askham engraving. It's often referenced among that Cheek circle. Roger Askham's seminal educational work, The Schoolmaster, borrowed heavily from what he called those old noble Persians, and they kind of gave copies of it as presents to each other, I suppose, into the 1560s. So with the publication of the Cyropaedia just before Barker's return to England, his new career outside Cambridge was launched, though it took a couple of years for him to find a post in the Howard household, where he'd remain. He continued to publish translations from Greek, Latin and Italian, including a manuscript presentation to Queen Elizabeth of A Disputation of the Nobility of Women, which he presented to her soon after her accession, a translation from Lodovico Domenichi's Italian original. Although Rayner Wolfe only printed one more of Barker's works, I've discovered that each and every one of Barker's works, each of his printed publications after that, can be linked directly back to Wolfe. So in other words, they're printed by printers who were apprenticed to Wolfe, who were friends of his, or who married into his family. So in other words, what we find is a Catholic scholar subscribing to and being published by a Protestant humanist circle with a particular agenda for the promotion of Greek scholarship and the Greek Church Fathers for political as well as religious purposes. And this happens whether under Protestant or Catholic rule. But if we go back for a second to Barker's years in Italy from 1549 to 53, to think about the sort of travel part of the title. Although he probably left St. John's College because of religious tensions within the college, and there was a lot of it was being transacted at the level of college politics. I'm sure that will be a massive surprise to any of you who've ever been in a university, that the politics of small departments can reflect larger tensions within the state. It turns out that the years he spent in Italy were also enriched by the company of contemporaries from St. John's, again, members of the Cheek Circle. Italy, though, was crucial to Barker's literary confidence and his resources. Besides his clear enjoyment of the language, and he loved boasting about how good he was at Italian and how much he loved it, it gave impetus and shape to his subsequent scholarly translations, previously moulded on the humanist educational model, but now aiming for a wider and more elite readership. And his contacts in Italy, taking advantage of the tolerance for which cities like Siena were known, crossed confessional boundaries and put him in contact with radical Italian Catholics as well as the evangelical Protestants of his St. John's days. So what little we know about Barker's 3 years or so in Italy comes to us from the travel diary of Sir Thomas Hoby, whose hugely influential English translation of Castiglione's courtesy book, Il Cortegiano, was published much later, but which some scholars think was actually begun while he was in Italy this first time, during his time travelling with Barker. Hoby reports meeting Barker and others in Siena in September 1549. Again, Hoby is an alumnus of St. John's College, Cambridge, and another member of the Cheek Circle. And Cheek, of course, in fact, if you know that first edition, the first translation of Castiglione, there's that Cheek actually contributes a very warm defence of vernacular translation to his friend as a preface to it, unusually enough for Cheek actually. Barker does take, Hobie's diary tells us that Barker took a trip to Rome with Hobie, with Peter Whitethorn, translator of Machiavelli, and Henry Parker, son of Henry Parker, Lord Morley, who had translated Boccaccio. They travelled with the express purpose of seeing the funeral obsequies of Pope Paul III, the Pope who, of course, had excommunicated Henry VIII in 1538, and one has to wonder what exactly the motivations of that mixed group might have been, and also to see the new Pope elected. As Hobie reports, I thought it convenient to make a journey thither at this time, being so nigh as well to the city as to behold the manner of the obsequies and the fashion how they elect another. They met other Englishmen there, on the Catholic side, including some people, also Catholic scholars from St. John's. And according to Hobie, the English expected Reginald Pole to be elected Pope, but when that didn't transpire, and apparently it was one of the longest conclaves, at least in the period, instead they devoted themselves to thoroughly searching out the antiquities of Rome, no small task. After that, Barker, Hobie and the others travel onwards to Naples via Ostia, by land and sea. And eventually Hobie and Barker part ways for the sake, Hobie says, of his language learning. He doesn't want to have this English guy hanging around him if he's going to start learning the language. But they do meet again back in Siena a few months later. Hobie's diary remains in manuscript, but after his return to London, Barker's travels to northern and southern Italy are published in a very unusual, or at least to me unusual form, in a book of ancient and contemporary epitaphs that he gathered en route. And these place Barker all over the place in ancient as well as modern cities, from Padua to and Florence, Certaldo, Siena, to ancient cities like Alba Longa, Aversa, Chiusi and Notera. Although the vast majority of the epitaphs are from Rome and Naples, and they do chime quite closely with Hobie's account of their stay in those cities. And there's some theory that maybe even Hobie borrowed from Barker's work in putting together his diary. What Hobie's account gives us then is a glimpse into a community of Englishmen in Italy, some of whom were studying at universities such as Padua, some of whom were escaping religious oppression at home, and some of whom were engaged in an emerging mode of educational travel that would only gain traction as a precursor of the Grand Tour later in the 16th century. And it's likely in the case of Barker that all three motivations overlapped. For someone like Barker, who later declared that he, quote, thought good to add an experience of travel and knowledge of more countries than mine own. Certainly he accumulated books as well as language and new companions in Italy, and he made a point of befriending the Italian community in London upon his return. He returned to England in 1553 after the death of Edward, the accession of Mary. And again, there's kind of an interesting contrast with Cheek, who actually at that very same point fled Mary's England to travel to Italy, again with the Hobies and also with Anthony Cook, father of Mildred. Returning to a newly Catholic England, finding his Cyropaedia published, Barker also published an important translation of St. Basil's sermon defending the reading of classical authors, although he sort of slightly cheekily used it to condemn the Reformation as a whole and describing it as merely a factious device, you know, that all this stuff is just a factious device. But he'd also brought home 2 Italian books he'd later translate, Lodovico Domenichi's Treatise in Defense of Women, which, as I said, he'd present to Queen Elizabeth 1559, and Giambattista Gelli's I Capricci del Battaio, a comic dialogue between a Florentine cooper and his soul, which was published 7 or 8 years later. And his comments on the Gelli, I think, are kind of interesting for what they reveal of Barker's interest while he was in Italy, but also his sense of the horizon of opportunities available to him as a low-born man. Giambattista Gelli, he reminds his readers, was both a tailor and, quote, for his wisdom, chief of the vulgar University of Florence when I was there. What he's talking about is the Accademia Fiorentina, not the university, which besides its promotion of vernacular literature, although which vernacular literature is contentious, it was also frequented by Lodovico Domenichi, whose work Barker also translated, and was known for its exploration of more radical religious views. Barker uses the preface to foreground his ambition, and this is another quote, that my countrymen may see how learning may appear in all sorts of men, and they deserve praise when they will use it well. The undervaluing, in other words, of his own learning seems to be a sore point. And again, we find this in the dedicatory epistle to the full translation, the full edition of Xenophon, which bemoans his status as a forlorn scholar not able to keep credit in learning. So in other words, Barker's travels in Italy brought him into close contact again with more St. John's of the St. John's Circle, but they also brought him to visit radical new intellectual establishments such as the Accademia Fiorentina, with its emphasis on vernacular translation and literature, and years later he would speak with pride of his accomplishment in Italian and his ongoing interest in Italian culture. Let me move on to the treason part. The Cheek Circle, with their strong Protestant character, were out of favour or in exile when he returned, as I said, so it wasn't them but the more traditional patronage of the Howards that he had had in first going to Cambridge that basically got him a job in the Howard household in the mid-1550s. He was secretary to Thomas, as I said. He was probably tutor to his son Philip, but he eventually became one of 2 senior secretaries in the household and thrived, as Norfolk did, at his London as well as his Norfolk house. But the wheels started to come off in the late 1560s when Howard foolishly got drawn into the so-called Ridolfi plot, in which, sorry, I just have to be moving around. The Ridolfi plot, in which Mary, Queen of Scots, together with Philip of Spain, Pope Pius, and the Florentine banker Roberto Ridolfi, put together a plan to invade eastern England, displace Elizabeth, marry Thomas Howard to Mary, Queen of Scots, and install the pair of them on the throne instead. Have I got this later on. Clearly, Howard, I think, it was a pretty ridiculous kind of a plan, and Howard hadn't exactly thought it through. Mary didn't have a brilliant reputation with her husband having already murdered one and being still married to the guy who'd been accused of the murder of the previous one. The plot was intercepted, and Howard, as well as the secretary Barker and others from the household, were interrogated in the Tower, where things didn't go too well for them. And the more I read about it, the more I see Howard as the sort of willing stooge in this plot, the more I see Barker as having some contribution to make. Certainly he accepted and hid secret messages, ciphered messages from Mary, Queen of Scots. In fact, he even wrote some poems that he sent to Mary, Queen of Scots, and asked if she'd like to read some poems in the English metre. He accepted letters from the Pope and Philip of Spain. He brought Ridolfi into the house, usually through the back door. And allegedly, he also was the person who most often met Ridolfi. And allegedly, as he said and as others said, because he could speak Italian. And he kind of makes a big deal of the fact that because he speaks Italian so well, that he's the one who should meet Ridolfi. He is arrested and brought to the Tower of autumn of 1570, and his interrogators are very quick to establish that Barker was up to his neck in the plotting. Their letters, they write back to William Cecil, as I said. He's the chief guy in charge of handling all of this. He's the guy who sets the interrogators to their task. He's the guy who reports back to Elizabeth. And what they say is, as for Barker, this is after about 2 weeks of questioning, as for Barker, I think he hath and will confess to so much as his wit will serve him. And yet, as it appeareth, he hath been the most doer betwixt the Duke and other foreign practisers. In other words, Barker is, as I say, up to it, in it up to his neck. It was actually the first time that Elizabeth had explicitly commanded that suspects of any kind be put to the rack, be tortured. Previously, she had sort of let it be understood. And yet the funny thing is that Barker was never put to the rack, but Howard's other principal secretary was, even despite his examiner's sense. I mean, they'd already written to Cecil that Bannister indeed knoweth very little, and that instead Barker was the common doer in the practice as appeareth. This is another 2 weeks later. So they're very sort of clear on their sense of what's happening. It's highly suspicious, and I don't think Barker's cooperation explains it, because actually he's not cooperating. For a long time he contended that he never was but a messenger, no persuader nor practicer, and that he knew or remembered very little as a result. But a few days after Bannister was put to the rack, the interrogators' letters to Cecil suddenly change their tune, and they start to emphasise Barker's lack of wit. They write now that Barker was, quote, rather it may seem chosen for zeal than wit. So in other words, he was kind of more zealous in the task than smart. What he hath done, we take it, is opened at the last in some form with our help. For of his own wit he could never have done it, so it is confused and without order. So now they don't simply exonerate Barker as some kind of a fool, but they shift the blame fully onto Howard, and they take the opportunity to adjust their earlier narrative along the way. As our opinion was, so it remaineth, that only the Duke's foolish devotion to that woman, Mary Queen of Scots, kept the fire kindling. Once this narrative of Barker's weak wit has been established, funnily enough, Barker's poor memory begins to trouble him less, and all kinds of things come back to him. The floodgates open, and in fact it's largely on Barker's testimony that Norfolk is convicted. For his part, Norfolk condemns Barker's testimony as the untrustworthy account of an Italianified Englishman. Why would you believe that? He implies. But to no avail, it's Norfolk who's brought for execution. A few years later, Barker is pardoned and leaves the Tower, and he manages to publish one more translation, the Appian, which is up here, but he dies in sort of careful obscurity. There's a guy I theorise about who it could be him later on, but we don't know. He disappears. On the other hand, I think this is 1578, so a few years after he's been released, and I think it's usually, you can see his name appears on the title page. Except in the Appian translation, there's no name on the title page. Instead, the printer has and there's no message from Barker as a dedication or any kind of preface to the reader. And instead, you get this, the printer saying, "How God plagueth them that conspire against their prince, this history declareth at the full." So I think, for those who are in the know, I think this could be a case of a nod's as good as a wink. So just to be clear, what I'm sort of saying is that the interrogation of suspects in what was the first serious attempt on Elizabeth's life and throne following her excommunication by the Pope in 1570 is pretty suspicious, primarily in terms of its treatment of Barker. But all becomes clear when we see who the interrogators are: Sir Thomas Smith and Thomas Wilson, two key members of the Cheek Circle, who were later joined by other trusted supporters of Cecil at the edges of the Cheek Circle, Mildmay and Francis Knollys. It was Smith and Wilson who shaped the narrative about Barker for Cecil. My point is really that all four men, although they didn't acknowledge it, all four men were known to one another from St. John's 30 years before, specifically through the Cheek Circle. I never wanted it to be an old boys network that kind of came good 30 years later, but it's starting to look that way. All of them remain committed to the cause of Greek scholarship, even now 30 years later, and it looks like those loyalties ran even deeper than their loyalties to the state. Less than a year before this interrogation, Wilson had published his translation of 3 speeches by Demosthenes, complaining about Philip of Macedon, yet another continuation of the Cheekian Greek project. That translation was dedicated to none other than William Cecil, and it took the time to recall to Cecil in the preface their scholarly debts, the scholarly debts of both Cecil and Wilson to the long-dead Cheek. And Wilson went further in spelling out the work's relevance, that it wasn't just Philip of Macedon who might be threatening, but Philip of Spain at the moment as well. Thomas Smith, the other interrogator, was another former fellow at St. John's College, had been a vocal supporter of Cheek's reform of Greek pronunciation in the 1540s, and was another close connection of Cecil's. And of course, Cecil himself, to whom their letters and reports were issued, was known to value Greek scholarship, and not just obviously in his wife. So what I'm suggesting, I suppose, is that this trio who knew William Barker, they knew his work, and they knew of Cheek's support of him, cooked up a story, effectively, about his lack of wit to get him off the charge of treason. That's all very interesting, I suppose, to me anyway, in its own very local way. But let me just step back a minute and ask why this kind of very small story might be of interest for our larger sense, or the wider sense of how Tudor culture worked. And I found sort of interesting, there's a 2009 essay by Colin Burrow on ways of reading Elizabethan writing politically, in which he sort of models a new set of concepts. Each person in this period, it's the second quote, each person in this period, he proposes, subsisted within a complex web of what might be called, for shorthand, networks and affinities, juridical structures and projects. All of these interacted in complex, non-linear ways. So basically, networks and affinities is kind of kinship, professional, religious and social ties, so something like a guild tie, connections within the parish, or friendship ties. Juridical structures refers to the local, legal and national structures in which the citizen is bound. In other words, the people that you are accountable to legally for your actions. But his third category, I think, is kind of interesting down the bottom. It's a diachronic category. It's something that Colin Burrow says specifically as something that traverses time as one of its key features. The category of projects refers to a collective enterprise with its own distinctive material needs. The example Colin Burrow gives is the colonising of Ireland, for example. But other kind of less material intergenerational projects are relevant. And what I'd suggest is that the intergenerational Cheekian project of Greek studies in Tudor England is one such project, one which drew a network of early modern persons of quite different affinities and experience. So thinking about a project means we can uncover the kinds of alliances and support that writers made available to one another, even across religious divides, and through the activities of more equal patrons. The advantage, I think, of Burrow's model is that it unsettles any assumptions of political and religious unity within particular groups. So whether, it's followers of the Earl of Essex or translators of Greek authors or Catholic conspirators, we don't expect them all to be politically and socially uniform if we think about it in terms of projects rather than in terms of, I suppose, the individuals and the ostensible politics of it. And it accepts, as I say, that a project or network might bring together unlikely agents, or might at certain times produce affinities that contradict or even supersede the political and religious allegiances to which we as critics, I suppose, are sometimes too quick to jump. So what Barker's life and work show us, I think, is the significance of social and intellectual networks to literary enterprise and publication in the period. How they're more collaborative, more political, perhaps less sectarian than we might expect of a period of such religious and political division. From looking at this one forgotten figure in the complex tapestry of English Renaissance writing, I think, I wonder whether we might want to reconsider the larger cultural history of the English Renaissance to try and take in a deeper sense of the social nature of authorship and publication, to try and take account of the networks and affinities, and above all, to take more seriously the shared projects that often propelled literary production and reception. If we do this, I propose, and I'm finishing up now, if we do this, I think we'd be able to see how much more politically interesting the English Renaissance can be, how much more socially diverse, and how much more international its character. And we might even find ourselves heartened by how people continue to reach across confessional divides to one another, even in such a turbulent period of crisis and conflict. Thank you.